let me tell you about the single most expensive dinner in galactic history. It was supposed to be a celebration, a glittering symbol of interspecies cooperation, a feast to prove that the galaxy's oldest rivals could share a table without vaporizing each other. And technically, they did. Technically. The Galactic Council of Unified Worlds, or as insiders call it, the Council of Everything That Shouldn't Work, meets once every century to remind itself that civilization is a miracle powered by paperwork. It's a place where 10,000 languages collide in slow motion, where political tension is considered a condiment, and where the only thing more dangerous than disagree. The council hall itself is a spectacle of architectural confusion, a floating citadel suspended above the neutral world of Ronath Prime. Imagine a cathedral, a courthouse, and a theme park welded together by creatures that have never agreed on the concept of straight lines. Every wall hums with translation runes. Every corridor smells faintly of ozone, diplomacy, and suppressed rage. Protocol here is sacred. There's an entire department dedicated to measuring how long a bow should last, and another that determines which direction you're allowed to breathe during a greeting. The Voronoxy race, for instance, considers it rude to blink while being introduced. The Tekelians who interpret blinking as a sign of weakness. Last year, 2 ambassadors accidentally declared war through mutual eye contact. So, yes, decorum is important. And then there's the greetings. Every species brings its own. The Carthaginians perform a rhythmic throat chant that lasts 47 minutes and must be witnessed by exactly 12 people. The Xylar Consortium prefers to exchange encrypted data packets directly into each other's spines, which is technically illegal in 9 sectors, but considered cultural expression. The Grell Alliance just sheds, politely. The Council's official translator corps consists of 300 certified telepaths, 4,000 neural interpreters, and 1 nervous intern with a microphone who always seems on the verge of crying. On average, a single good morning takes 6 hours and requires a small medical team. Yet somehow, it works. Mostly, because for all the chaos, the Council has endured for 900 years. It's the galaxy's beating heart of bureaucracy, where wars are paused, treaties are misread, and occasionally, something resembling peace is achieved. And this cycle, there was something new on the agenda. A first. A species so young, so inexplicably reckless, that most assumed it was a practical joke when their membership request came through. Earth. The humans. You've probably heard the rumors. The creatures that weaponized caffeine, survived their own atmosphere, and send diplomatic messages written entirely in sarcasm. Officially, the Council accepted them for their unique adaptive biology. Unofficially, everyone just wanted to see if they'd actually show up. To commemorate this historic inclusion, the Council organized a grand diplomatic banquet. 1,000 dishes, each carefully tailored to the digestive needs of over 100 species. Each course vetted by the Intergalactic Bureau of Ingestive Safety. Each table arranged according to 14 layers of interstellar etiquette, and none of them designed for bipeds with cowboy hats. The invitations went out. The banners were raised. The chefs began synthesizing ingredients from across 17 worlds. And in the shadows of the administrative decks, not everyone was celebrating. Because while most saw the banquet as a symbol of peace, others saw it as an opportunity to remove a variable, to eliminate the unpredictable factor before it caused trouble. They called it a containment measure. History would later call it something else. The night the universe got indigestion. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At the time, no one suspected a thing. The council buzzed with anticipation. Delegates rehearsed their greetings. The translators stocked up on anxiety medication. And the kitchens, those hallowed, steaming sanctuaries, worked tirelessly to prepare the perfect meal. And for the first time in galactic record, one of those plates was labeled for human consumption.
It began, as most diplomatic incidents do, with a greeting gone wrong. The Galactic Council Chamber, an architectural masterpiece shaped like a collapsed neutron star, shimmered in ceremonial hues of violet and gold. Every delegate stood poised in perfect synchronization, antennae aligned, gills fluttering, mandibles polished to an almost religious shine. The atmosphere hummed with reverence. After all, today marked the first official appearance of Homo sapiens, a species recently admitted into the grand experiment of galactic cooperation. Each representative rehearsed their part in the greeting ritual. 12 bows, clockwise rotation, pause for collective inhalation, recitation of the peace mantra, and one respectful silence lasting precisely 37 seconds. When the chamber doors slid open, humanity entered. Ambassador Jack Carson of the United States of America, Earth's chosen emissary, strolled into the hall as though he'd just wandered into a small-town barbecue. He wore a suit that might have been formal once, before gravity and personality had their say. A bolo tie gleamed like an accidental insult to interstellar decorum. His boots clicked against the polished obsidian floor with a confidence that belonged more to cattle ranches than diplomatic halls. And in his mouth, audibly and unmistakably, he was chewing gum. Minister Zylar of the Triune Council nearly fainted. The Zilarian tongue, a sensitive organ of etiquette, twitched involuntarily at the rhythm of each chew. Carson paused at the center of the room, tilted his hat politely, an artifact from a planet that still thought fabric was fashion, and said the single most destabilizing word in galactic protocol. "Howdy!" It traveled through the chamber like a sonic weapon. 1,000 translators simultaneously scrambled to define it. In Krellic, it translated as, "Prepare for honorable combat." In Sarnian, "Your offspring owe me tribute." And in the diplomatic corps' official trade language, it simply appeared as error. Carson looked around. Do y'all shake hands or what? No one moved. The first bow was missed. The second bow collided with the silence. By the 12th, several ambassadors had fainted, convinced the ritual had somehow been inverted into a declaration of war. The council's presiding officer, Minister Zylar, cleared his throat, an action that sounded like a harp falling down a staircase. "Ambassador Carson of Earth," he began cautiously, "we welcome your presence to this most esteemed gathering of minds." Jack smiled. "Appreciate it, Minister. Hope y'all got coffee." A silence followed, long enough to qualify as a separate geological era. Zylar adjusted his ceremonial head crest. "Your attire is unconventional." Carson looked down at himself. "Yeah, laundry bots on the ship broke. Guess I'm going with the space cowboy aesthetic today." The chronicler, in the press box, noted the phrase "space cowboy" in bold, underlined it twice, and added, "possible religious title." One of the insectoid elegates, a thin, trembly creature named Ziv, whispered, "Does he know we record everything?" "Perhaps it's intentional," murmured another. "Humans thrive on unpredictability. It's a survival mechanism." A third added darkly, "They're omnivorous. They consume anything." The rumor spread like wildfire across the chamber. Humans, it seemed, were not only omnivorous, but emotionally unpredictable, capable of humor in the face of annihilation and indifference towards hierarchy. Minister Zylar whispered to his aide, "They terrify me." Carson, meanwhile, seemed blissfully unaware of the panic he was causing. He was admiring the chandelier, a hovering bioorganism that emitted calming pheromones, and remarked, "We had one of those back in Texas, called it a jellyfish." 3 delegates gasped. One began praying. The chronicler, observing from his high seat of neutral duty, recorded, "Subject Carson demonstrates what scholars may later classify as the human disruption field, a phenomenon in which procedural order decays proportionally to the human's level of relaxation." Zylar attempted to recover the atmosphere. "Ambassador Carson," he said, forcing a smile that stretched 3 sets of jaws, "the Council honors Earth's arrival among the civilized stars. You are a young species, yet remarkably resilient." Carson nodded. "We do our best. Usually duct tape fixes the rest." Several translators emitted sparks trying to render duct tape into something meaningful. The final translation that appeared on screen read, "Temporal adhesive of divine origin." The audience applauded, some fainted again. The chronicler noted, "Applause was spontaneous but medically ill-advised." The human sat down, uninvited but perfectly comfortable. He crossed one leg over the other, took out a data pad, and began sketching something. When asked later what it was, he replied, "Just drawing a horse, been a while." Diplomatic chaos tends to move in slow waves, but that day it moved fast. For the first time in council history, protocol failed to keep pace with personality. Every ambassador knew they were witnessing something unprecedented, a creature that followed no rules but made everyone else question why they had them. And the chronicler, in his careful, dry prose, wrote the summary that would echo through the archives for centuries. Ambassador Jack Carson, a paradox wearing polished boots. Earth's first representative, informal, unpredictable, dangerously likable. The council's structure trembled, not from aggression, but from charm. Thus began humanity's official debut among the stars, with gum, a grin, and a greeting that no translator would ever forget.
There is a saying among the elder races of the galaxy: you may judge a species by what it dares to eat. If that were true, humanity's reputation was doomed from the beginning. The council banquet, the ceremonial feast of interstellar unity, was less a dinner and more a bureaucratic miracle disguised as indigestion. Every dish served represented centuries of cultural heritage, ecological dominance, and in some cases, chemical warfare. Each race contributed its own sacred cuisine. The Krell served bone custard, a dish that required one to apologize to it before eating. The Andromelans offered storm fruit souffle, which occasionally discharged lightning when complimented. And the Ovarians, in a display of diplomatic boldness, brought liquid silence, a beverage that erased your ability to complain about the food for precisely 7 hours. To dine among the stars was, quite literally, to risk your life in polite company. The etiquette manual, a glowing crystal slab containing 47,000 pages of culinary law, began with the reassuring line, "All participants accept the possibility of temporary death." Still, tradition demanded participation. To refuse a dish was an insult. To survive it was considered a toast. And now, for the first time in history, a human was to dine. The council kitchens, located somewhere between a cathedral and a military laboratory, erupted in quiet panic. The head chef, a gelatinous mass of culinary sentience named Bartok, hovered nervously over the preparation tables. It had cooked for emperors, pirates, and species who metabolize sound waves, but never for a human. "They eat unpredictable things," Bartok muttered. "Sweet, salty, bitter, toxic. There is no logic. They consume pleasure and punishment in equal measure." The sous chefs, representing 7 different digestive philosophies, tried to assist. One suggested replicating a traditional human dish called pizza, but the simulation ended with a minor explosion and a debate about whether extra cheese qualified as a threat level. To make matters worse, the Xyloths had taken an interest in the event. The Xyloths were a proud reptilian species with a long history of subtle aggression and unsubtle cooking.
Their representative had not forgotten the day humanity was admitted into the council before them, an insult that festered like spoiled venom. Their plan was elegant in its cruelty. They would ensure the human's dish was accidentally seasoned with Voron-9, a neurotoxin so potent it once won a Culinary Innovation Award for Most Effective Deterrent. It induced paralysis, hallucinations, and an overwhelming desire to apologize before dying. The plan required finesse. Unfortunately, finesse was not the Xyloth's strength. In the council, even assassination had paperwork. Before any diplomatic poisoning, 12 separate committees had to approve the act, including the Ethics Board, the Department of Perception Management, and the Subcommittee for Accidental Offenses. Form 9F, Intent to Slightly Harm, needed 5 signatures. Form 12A, Intent to Preserve Plausible Deniability, required a majority vote. And Form 7R, Intent to Pretend it was a cultural misunderstanding, could only be filed in triplicate during daylight hours on a planet that no longer existed. By the time the syndicate finished their paperwork, the banquet had already begun. In the grand chamber, tables spiraled outward like a cosmic mandala, each setting a different gravity level to suit the guests. Crystal goblets hummed with resonant frequency. The air shimmered with the scent of ozone, pheromones, and mild terror. Delegates took their seats, adjusting filtration masks and diplomatic smiles. Every species prepared itself for an evening of calculated poisoning, political niceties, and applause. Except, that is, the human. Ambassador Jack Carson was late. The orchestra, an arrangement of floating fungi that emitted harmonic spores, had already played the Anthem of Unity twice. Minister Xylar was beginning to lose bioluminescent composure. Aidbots whispered updates. Human shuttle detected, slowing, stopping at vending kiosk, resuming approach. And then, at last, the doors parted. Jack Carson entered with the kind of casual indifference that should have been outlawed by every code of decorum. In one hand, he carried a steaming paper cup. The scent drifted through the hall, rich, bitter, earthy. "Sorry," he said, sliding into his seat with a grin. "Traffic in hyperspace." No one laughed. Several translators malfunctioned trying to parse the joke. Minister Xylar's frills dimmed 3 shades of disbelief. Carson set the coffee down beside his ceremonial goblet of nutrient plasma and squinted at the cutlery arrangement. 12 utensils of varying sharpness, shape, and existential purpose. He picked one up, turned it over thoughtfully, and muttered, "Y'all heard of a spoon?" The council watched, frozen. The head chef trembled in the shadows. The Xylos leaned forward, eager for the toxin's debut performance. Carson, completely unfazed by the galaxy's collective anxiety, reached for the plate placed before him, a glistening medley of interspecies offerings, now unknowingly laced with Voron-9. He sniffed. He poked it with the fork. He looked mildly impressed. "Well, it sure smells better than airline food." Minister Xylar blinked rapidly, unsure if this was praise or threat. Carson took a sip of his coffee, sighed contentedly, and leaned back. The orchestra hesitated, unsure whether to resume playing or begin the funeral hymn. It was the quiet before disaster, the moment every delegate present would later describe differently, some as a divine comedy, others as galactic horror. The human had arrived, the table was set, and the universe, though it didn't know it yet, was about to learn something new about Earth's most dangerous weapon: casual confidence.
In every culture, there came a moment when diplomacy meets digestion and loses. This was that moment. The dish arrived on a levitating tray, escorted by 6 attendants in radiation aprons. It was, by every measurable standard, an abomination worthy of worship. Its surface shimmered like molten glass, exhaling faint vapors that corroded nearby cutlery. A quiet hum vibrated through the table, as if the food itself was reconsidering existence. The council's chronicler, committed to accuracy, recorded its composition with scientific precision. Dish, consortium fusion platter, contains trace elements fatal to 97% of known species. Aroma, metallic sweetness, suggestive of ozone and despair. Texture, variable, oscillating between solid, gas, and regret. Even before the plate touched the table, several delegates activated their emergency wills. Ambassador Jack Carson regarded the creation with mild curiosity. "He looks fancy. Smells like something my buddy cooked at a tailgate once. Hope it's got kick." Minister Zylar tried to smile, but succeeded only in rearranging his face into a look that suggested both admiration and funeral planning. The Xyloth Syndicate watched intently from their section, their pupils narrowing into slits of anticipation. One of them whispered, "Observe, the toxin will begin dissolving his neural lining within seconds." Another replied, "He will twitch once, emit smoke, and fall gracefully. It will be art." The orchestra held a single trembling note. Carson picked up his fork, the wrong one, of course, and cut into the dish. The room fell into the kind of silence that feels like it might shatter glass. The fork hissed slightly as it made contact. Tiny sparks danced up the metal. The slice emitted a faint sound, halfway between a sigh and a growl. Carson didn't notice. He popped it into his mouth. He chewed once, twice, stopped. Every organism in the chamber held its breath, which for some species was an immediate medical emergency. Carson's face went still. His brow furrowed slightly. Then, with the calm deliberation of a man judging barbecue sauce, he said, "Tastes like spicy shrimp cocktail with motor oil. I'll take seconds." The universe collapsed. Delegates screamed in frequencies unregistered by human ears. A psychic emissary fainted and accidentally transmitted a death prophecy to 6 neighboring minds. Medics rushed forward, colliding with each other, dropping antidotes, arguing over which species' lungs humans possessed. Carson just sat there, still chewing. He dabbed his mouth with a ceremonial napkin, a living organism that whimpered softly, and said, "Is this gluten-free?" The chef fainted into its own gelatinous mass. Minister Zylar, trembling with horror and awe, whispered, He still lives." "No," replied a nearby delegate, "he thrives." Carson took another bite, and another. He swallowed, leaned back in his chair, and nodded appreciatively. "Gotta say, y'all know how to season. That's a kick I ain't had since Houston." A faint sizzling came from the table where a few drops of sauce had landed. The wood began to smoke. He blew on it casually. Bit spicy, though. Could use a beer. The Xyloth Syndicate stared, their scales paling to a color previously unknown to biology. One muttered, "Impossible. Voron-9 liquefies nervous tissue." Another whispered, "Perhaps the human has no nervous tissue." The chronicler took note. Subject Carson demonstrates full motor control and inappropriate enthusiasm. Medics begged him to stop. Diplomats screamed for the antidote. Carson shrugged. "Antidote for what? It's delicious." He then did the unthinkable, reached for the serving tray and spooned himself another helping. The room collectively gasped. Zylar made a small choking sound. Someone in the back shouted, "He's eating it recreationally!" Carson smiled, entirely content. "Don't let it go to waste, folks. Y'all paid for it." When asked later how he felt, he replied, "A little tingly, but that might just be the caffeine." The chronicler, with the restraint of one recording a supernova politely, noted, "Subject Carson's biological parameters remain stable. The toxin's known effects, paralysis, hallucination, organ implosion, appear to have been replaced by satisfaction." One of the telepathic observers tried to scan his thoughts, only to recoil in confusion. She whispered, "I touched his mind, and it tastes like bacon grease and optimism." In the corner, the chef stirred weakly, its body quivering with existential dread. He asked for seconds.
The council, paralyzed between horror and awe, watched as the human reached the bottom of his plate, wiped it clean with a piece of bread he had brought himself, and sighed contentedly. Well, that hit the spot. Compliments to the chef. Next time, y'all should try some chili powder. Zylar's voice broke on the reply. Ambassador Carson, you survive? Carson blinked. Wasn't supposed to? And that was the moment history changed. For centuries, the galaxy would remember the first human banquet not as a diplomatic exchange, but as the day a man from Earth ate a bioweapon, complimented the flavor, and asked for seconds. The Council's official records summarized it with brutal simplicity. Subject Carson remains alive. Status: requesting recipe. The statistics said survival was impossible. Reality apparently was offended.
The council chamber erupted into what historians would later call an orchestrated descent into civility failure. Every alarm, both physical and metaphysical, began to wail. Red lights, blue pheromones, and distress spores filled the air in a chromatic festival of panic. The Galactic Med Corps deployed instantly, a blur of limbs, tentacles, and hovering diagnostic drones. They surrounded Ambassador Jack Carson like priests at resurrection, each shouting contradictory instructions in their native dialects. One medic attempted to inject him with antivenom. Another screamed that antivenom might make the human explode. A third insisted they needed to ground his biofield by wrapping him in copper foil. Carson raised an eyebrow. Y'all ever considered just asking how I feel? They didn't. They couldn't. They were too busy declaring the first implementation of Galactic Chaos Protocol 7B, a rarely used emergency policy reserved for scenarios like planetary implosion or unexpected musical outbreaks. The chronicler's notes record the scene with bureaucratic restraint. Council initiated containment. Medics swarmed Subject Carson. Panic was deemed a cultural expression. Meanwhile, the interstellar press, sensing the scent of scandal, activated live feeds across 12 sectors. Every news outlet, from Andromeda Daily to the Wormhole Gazette, broadcast the same image: a human sitting calmly amid chaos, sipping coffee while diplomats screamed in 17 languages. The caption on most screens read, "Earth representative defies death, requests refill." Minister Exelar, caught between protocol and cardiac arrest, tried to restore order. "Silence! We must not panic!" he shouted, as if panic were an optional activity. Carson looked up, blinking slowly. "You're doing great, Minister. Real calm-like." The medics continued scanning him, their instruments flickering in disbelief. Vital signs. Stable. Toxin concentration. Absorbed? Absorbed where? Another demanded. It should have liquefied his frontal cortex. Perhaps it did, murmured a third. Maybe humans don't need one. Carson chuckled. Now that's rude. He leaned back, legs crossed, as a medic cautiously prodded his arm with a bioscanner. Hey, partner, that tickles. Mind not poking me like a brisket on a smoker? The translator hesitated, then rendered brisket as sacred mammalian sacrifice. 3 species immediately began praying. The orchestra, still in the corner, had switched from the Anthem of Unity to a slow, confused rendition of Amazing Grace in 11 minor keys. Amidst the pandemonium, the chef Vartok regained partial consciousness. The gelatinous mass trembled with guilt. "I have failed the council. I have poisoned peace itself." Carson noticed the poor creature weeping quietly into its own surface and frowned sympathetically. "Ah, don't beat yourself up, buddy. Ain't your fault. I've had worse at roadside diners in Amarillo." Vartok blinked, which in its species required generating a small thunderclap. "You have survived this flavor before?" "Not exactly," Carson said. patting the chef's quivering shoulder with the delicacy of a man comforting a sentient pudding. "But I once had shrimp that glowed in the dark. Figured that was a sign of freshness." The chronicler noted, "Subject Carson displays emotional stability bordering on cosmic apathy." His words to the chef, "No worries, partner," now considered a recognized therapeutic phrase among several trauma species. The council guards tried to contain the scene by declaring a temporary lockdown. Emergency barriers shimmered into place, trapping everyone inside. The chamber's oxygen balance adjusted to crisis setting. The official statement was broadcast across every channel. Council declares temporary containment. Human subject under observation. Carson just nodded. "Containment, huh? Cool. Mind if I get something to snack on while y'all figure it out?" The medics froze. "You wish to eat more?" "Yeah," he said, looking at his empty plate. "Had a nice tang to it, kind of like spicy diesel. Y'all use paprika in there?" The Xyloth Syndicate, who had been quietly attempting to disappear into the wall, now resembled statues of guilt. Their leader tried to look impressed. Yes, a regional spice." Carson gave him a thumbs up, a gesture universally misinterpreted as a prelude to violence. Half the council dove under the table. The chronicler, ever calm, summarized. Human gestures continued to defy semiotic consistency. Council declares emergency lockdown. Human subject declares flavor note tangy. As medics analyzed blood samples that refused to obey chemistry, Carson decided the conversation was getting too serious. He turned to the cameras hovering nearby and said, "Hey, y'all, back on Earth. If anyone's watching this, tell my mom I'm fine. And tell NASA to patent whatever this sauce is." Across the galaxy, billions watched, transfixed. Hashtags emerged instantly. Hashtag human eats death. Hashtag tangy diplomacy. Hashtag fear the bolo tie. On one distant planet, a restaurant chain began advertising Earth-style spice without knowing what it meant. Minister XLR Vice Cracking finally managed, "Ambassador Carson, please remain still. You may be a hazard." Carson smiled. "Ain't the first time I've been called that." He raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To intergalactic friendship, fellas. Y'all sure make an impression." Silence fell again. That heavy, awestruck kind of silence that always follows disaster narrowly avoided or comedy executed perfectly. The chronicler concluded, "At timestamp 4209, panic transitioned to observation. Medics exhausted their vocabulary for impossible. Subject Carson remained serenely conversational. The galaxy, for the first time, began to suspect humanity might be less a species, more a phenomenon." And somewhere deep in the kitchens, a single chef whispered the words that would echo through culinary history. He called it tangy.
Hours that followed what the press would later call the dinner that rewrote biology, the council chambers became a forensic circus. Every moment of the banquet was replayed from 12 camera angles, 3 psychic echoes, and 1 interdimensional reflection, each offering the same inexplicable conclusion. The human lived. Security analysts leaned over their hollow screens, muttering equations that no longer applied. One investigator whispered, "Run the footage again." They did. On every playback, the pattern remained identical. The toxin enters the human system, biochemical chaos ensues, and then nothing. No convulsions, no cellular breakdown, just chewing. Slow, confident, heretical chewing. Minister Xylar presided over the post-incident tribunal, his bioluminescent frills still flickering between panic and existential dread.
Explain, he demanded, his voice cracking across the chamber. Explain how that is possible. The lead xenobiologist, a crystalline being named Dr. V. Lore, adjusted its refractive lenses nervously. The substance, Voron IX, neutralizes nerve systems on contact. Within seconds, all sentient activity ceases. Carson leaned back in his chair, sipping from his ever-present coffee cup. Guess ours didn't get the memo. A silence followed, the kind that in diplomatic circles counts as physical assault. The doctor blinked its 3 optical cores in disbelief. You are functioning? Cognitively? Far as I know, Carson shrugged, though I ain't sure anyone's ever accused me of that before. The chronicler's notes from this portion of the proceedings are restrained to the point of absurdity. The scientific community experienced collective confusion. It became apparent that humans are either immune or insane. Subject Carson demonstrated both possibilities concurrently. Behind the glass, observers debated furiously. Theories multiplied like tribbles. One argued that human DNA contained metallic residues that bonded with the toxin. Another proposed that caffeine, present in his bloodstream, acted as a natural anti-neurotic agent. A third suggested, with genuine horror, that perhaps the human nervous system was already toxic. Minister Zylar massaged the space between his eye ridges. So, he is fine? Physiologically, yes. Psychologically, uncertain. Carson smiled. Been that way my whole life. Meanwhile, the telepathic representative of the Vaughn Collective, a slender being of pure psionic energy, floated closer. We will see for ourselves, it intoned. We will enter the mind of the human. The room collectively leaned forward, eager for something resembling explanation. The telepath extended a filament of thought towards Carson's consciousness, a shimmering tendril of light that pierced the air between them. Carson watched it approach, then said, "Hope you like classic rock." The probe connected. For 0.7 seconds, all seemed calm. Then the telepath screamed, a sound like a dying star trying to yodel, and collapsed to the floor in a heap of incoherent energy. Medics rushed forward, scanning frantically. "What did you see?" cried Zylar. The telepath twitched. "Noise, endless noise, symbols, flames being seared over fire. The word yeehaw repeated in every frequency of consciousness. There was rhythm, but no order." Carson tilted his head. "You poked around while I was humming country music, didn't you?" The chronicler noted, "Telepathic assault aborted." Subject Carson began humming again, this time intentionally. The council chamber filled with the faint sound of him tapping his boot on the floor, keeping time to a melody no one else could hear. Some delegates mistook it for a primitive war rhythm. Others began recording it for cultural study. Dr. V. Lore clutched its datapad. "Ambassador, do you comprehend that you have invalidated 600 years of biochemical understanding?" Carson nodded. "Sounds about right. We've been doing that since we invented deep-fried butter." A pause. Then, quiet panic. Minister Zylar slumped into his chair. "So, the toxin cannot kill humans. Telepathy collapses upon contact. Are we to assume you are indestructible?" "Lord, no," Carson said, laughing. "We die all the time. Just, not politely." The room didn't know how to process that. Someone whispered, "Perhaps they metabolize insanity." Another murmured, "Perhaps they are insanity." Carson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Let me save y'all some time. We're just stubborn. If something tries to kill us, we either eat it, name it after a holiday, or marry it."
The translator paused before rendering the statement. Two diplomats fainted before it reached their ears. The chronicler summarized with bureaucratic grace. At 48:17, logic failed. At 48:19, laughter emerged. By 48:25, the Council conceded that humanity's survival mechanisms are not biological, but philosophical. Minister Zylar sighed, the light in his frills dimming into resignation. Then perhaps, Ambassador Carson, you could teach us your secret? Carson grinned. Sure thing. Step 1, don't lick anything that glows. Step 2, if it bites, fry it. Step 3, when in doubt, coffee. The chronicler hesitated before transcribing that, unsure if it was wisdom or warning. Across the galaxy, the feeds continued broadcasting. Alien commentators argued whether Earth's ambassador was a genius, a prophet, or a culinary disaster with legs. Fan clubs began forming, conspiracy cults too. One commentator summed it up best. Humanity has achieved what no other species could. They've made death itself feel embarrassed.
The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened at precisely 0900 Galactic Standard Time, though it did not achieve coherence until approximately never. Representatives from 32 species gathered beneath the shimmering dome of deliberation, an architectural marvel designed to promote rational discussion through acoustically optimized harmony. It had never worked. Today, it failed spectacularly. The topic was simple: what to do about Earth. Half the chamber wanted an alliance, the other half wanted quarantine, the remainder wanted a nap. Minister Zylar, whose frills still flickered with residual panic, opened the floor. We are gathered to discuss the incident involving Ambassador Carson and the survival thereof. A murmur spread across the hall. Survival had become a diplomatic euphemism for existential inconvenience. The delegate from the Xyloth Syndicate stood first, its voice oozing nervous charm. In our defense, the toxin was never meant for ingestion. Then why serve it as food? Snapped the reptilian envoy from the Threx Dominion. The Xyloth waved its claws helplessly. It was a metaphorical dish for unity. Unity? The Threx hissed. It nearly unified our entire digestive systems into a single puddle. The chronicler, recording with impeccable neutrality, observed. The debate began with accusations, escalated to philosophy, and briefly devolved into screaming in 12 musical keys. Meanwhile, Ambassador Carson sat at the center table, uninvited to speak, yet somehow still the gravitational center of the room. He had acquired a glass of what appeared to be Varisian fire wine, a beverage legally classified as both a liquid and a misdemeanor. He swirled it thoughtfully, watching the faint sparks flicker across its surface. "That's pretty," he muttered, then took a sip. Half the chamber gasped. The other half took notes. Minister Zylar slammed a claw against the table. "Ambassador Carson, that is not safe." Carson looked up, mildly puzzled. "Neither's diplomacy, far as I can tell." The chronicler noted, "Subject Carson continues voluntary experimentation with hazardous substances. Survival probability remains statistically offensive." A delegate from the Andromedan Concord leaned forward. "We must determine whether Earth poses a biological threat or a strategic advantage." The Von telepath, still recovering from psychic whiplash, croaked, "Both." This sparked a wave of argument. The scientist faction demanded containment and study.
The military bloc wanted immediate alliance, preferably one where humans face the enemy first. The theologists simply began praying loudly to the spirit of seasoning and stubbornness. As the shouting intensified, Carson raised his glass again and stood. "Mind if I say something?" The room fell into an uneasy silence. No one had technically given him the floor, but humanity had never cared much for floors. He cleared his throat, swaying just slightly. "Now, I ain't a scientist or a politician or whatever y'all call that fella screaming about weaponizing my stomach acid, but I'll tell you what I am. A man who likes a good meal and a fair fight." He paused to take another sip. The sparks from the wine danced in his eyes. "Back home, we got a saying, if it don't kill you, it just needs more salt. You see, we don't survive 'cause we're the strongest or the smartest. Nah, we survive 'cause we keep getting back up, usually hung over, sometimes on fire, but still kicking." A murmur rippled through the room. Some took notes, others checked for fire extinguishers. Carson gestured loosely with the glass. "You folks got rules for everything, protocols, committees. I seen y'all form 3 subcommittees just to panic properly. But where I come from, we got one rule: don't quit before dessert." He grinned. "Now maybe that makes us crazy. Maybe it makes us dangerous, but it also means we're damn hard to get rid of." He raised the glass in a mock toast. "So here's to survival, through seasoning and stubbornness." He drank. Sparks drifted upward. Somewhere an alarm began to softly wail. The chronicler summarized. Ambassador Carson delivered what historians would later call a theological turning point. The concept of stubborn grace was born, the belief that humanity's defiance is a divine attribute. Minister Zylar buried his face in his claws. He's turning intoxication into doctrine. Yet the delegates murmured with unexpected reverence. The priesthood of Velan recorded his words as sacred scripture. The Threx commander requested trade agreements with Earth before extinction becomes unfashionable. The Xyloth Syndicate proposed reparations in the form of a lifetime supply of antidotes and apology wine. By the end of the debate, the council was exhausted, inspired, and mildly drunk. The final resolution passed unanimously. Henceforth, no experimental substances, biochemical prototypes, or metaphysical entrees shall be served to human representatives. The chronicler concluded, dry as ever. Council resolution passed, never serve humans anything experimental again. Amendment proposed, or anything, period. Ambassador Carson smiled faintly, poured himself another glass, and said, "Well, I'll drink to that." And somewhere in the vastness of the galaxy, a new diplomated philosophy was quietly born, one that would shape centuries of interstellar relations. Never underestimate a species that treats poison like condiments.
And so it concludes. The council attempted to poison a human. The human called it lunch. From that moment, nothing in the galaxy remained the same, except, of course, the human. In the aftermath, 3 committees were formed to determine how this could have occurred. 4 others were formed to explain why. A 9th was quietly dissolved when it began to suspect the answer was simply because humans. The Council's biological division, after 8 sleepless cycles and 1 spontaneous resignation, reclassified Homo sapiens as high-resilience apex omnivores.
a designation previously reserved for species that required planetary-scale weaponry to inconvenience. Medical journals called it a biochemical paradox. Theologians called it proof of divine chaos. Culinary guilds called it a safety violation. But among the ordinary citizens of the galaxy, the merchants, engineers, and low-level administrators, watching the recording play for the 1000th time, it became something else entirely. A myth, a meme, a moment of existential comedy that refused to fade. The recording of Ambassador Jack Carson calmly eating a neurotoxin and complimenting its seasoning became the most viewed transmission in interstellar history. Entire planets debated whether the act was bravery, stupidity, or performance art. Some claimed it symbolized humanity's adaptability. Others believed it symbolized their complete lack of self-preservation. The Council, desperate to restore order, released an official statement. The human digestive system is not to be tested, challenged, or, under any circumstances, invited to buffet-style events. But the damage, or enlightenment, was already done. New diplomatic doctrines emerged. The Vallon theologians declared stubbornness of virtue. The Threx military began training recruits to eat first, regret later. Even the Xyloth Syndicate, authors of the original toxin, launched a restaurant franchise under the slogan, "As endorsed by humans, possibly edible." And through it all, the chronicler's voice remained steady, as if the universe itself required documentation to believe what had happened. Observation, the final entry reads. Humans are paradoxical entities. They adapt by misunderstanding the danger, endure by trivializing catastrophe, and inspire terror through the casual act of being themselves. Carson's own testimony, collected the next morning over black coffee and regret, consisted of exactly 5 words. "Y'all take things too seriously." His blood analysis revealed no trace of toxin, only caffeine, cholesterol, and an unidentified compound labeled attitude. For the Council, this discovery redefined resilience. For humanity, it redefined Tuesday. Centuries from now, scholars will argue whether the survival was biological or metaphysical, whether it proved human evolution, divine intervention, or a cosmic clerical error. But in the official record, one sentence endures. They tried to poison a human. The human called it lunch. And in that sentence lies the entire mystery of the species, a civilization that thrives not by avoiding chaos, but by digesting it, seasoning it, and asking for seconds. To those who measure greatness in empires, fleets, or firepower, humanity remains an enigma. Their empire is stubbornness. Their fleet is curiosity. Their weapon is appetite. Because in a galaxy obsessed with power, humans conquered it through appetite, an unkillable hunger for experience, danger, and one more bite. The chronicler pauses before sealing the archive, as if reluctant to close the file on a creature so alarmingly unkillable. End of HFY Datalog Entry 014. To ensure continued observation of human behavioral anomalies, the Council requests all sentient viewers to, what is this phrase? Like, subscribe, and enable notifications. Apparently, such rituals increase algorithmic visibility, thereby facilitating interstellar awareness. Failure to comply may result in another human ambassador being dispatched. A long pause, the sound of someone swallowing nervously. For the safety of this galaxy, please click the button.